I've had a long history of working with entrepreneurs, and I can't tell you how exciting it is to put my efforts and passion behind women entrepreneurs. So thank you to all of you. I'd like to begin before we get into the session with a land acknowledgement. I reside in the town, I believe it is, of village maybe, of Almont, which is west of Ottawa. And so I'll be speaking about the land acknowledgement from where I reside. So today, along the Mississippi River, we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. We acknowledge that this sacred land on which Mississippi Mills is now located has been a site of human activity for over 10,000 years and is rich in Indigenous history. We are grateful for the opportunity to continue the traditions of storytelling alongside these nations and the many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who reside here. We acknowledge and accept our responsibility to honor all our relations with peace, reciprocity, and respect. Through continual action, support, and accountability, we can further build a community that prioritizes inclusivity, shared space, and shared power. With that, we'll get started. Kerry, I can't see the slides yet, so, and I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I hadn't shared them yet. I was just waiting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So can you see the slides now? I will try to put them on there. So I'm on, I should be on presenter mode now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we should start with introduction of speakers. As you, I think, know, I'm Donna Price. I'm a governance coach. I do, it says there, board document writing and governance advisor for organizations. I have a 40-year background, 20 in legal services, where I worked in a lot of transactional work, also known as M&A, with some of Canada's top law firms. I worked in both Toronto and Ottawa. And the next 20, I think, following the theme song of 9 to 5 and wanting better work-life balance, I moved away from M&A, learned a ton, and got into governance because I was absolutely fascinated by the interactions of how a corporation worked, and particularly with the work of boards. So for the next 20 years, I worked with private, public, not-for-profit charities and a government agency, all on governance issues. About 4 or 5 years ago, another, seeking 9 to 5, and I think it's really my problem, not anyone who's put it on me. I shifted and rebranded to the Governance Boutique. And today, and Kerry's one of my colleagues, we work with both directors and with boards on recruiting and helping people, particularly women, find a board role, but prepare for one. And we cover all aspects of it. And we also work with organizations who are seeking board directors. We're focused on private companies, not public. And I absolutely love what I do, and I have some great colleagues around me. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kim.
Great. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. I think Donna and I have done this session now 3 times or 4 times?
3 or 4 at least.
At least. And the interest for us both collectively is that we grew up in, or not grew up, but we kind of evolved our careers through the kind of growth from startup companies through to larger entities, and that's what I have done. I've worked in a variety of small organizations, scaling, working in through both taking companies public, through fairly large M&A transactions of selling companies to the likes of Amdocs and Ericsson. I've worked for large companies as well, and both Ericsson and Amdocs. And my last stint was actually with Ericsson. So I left there about 2+ years ago. And since then have been working part-time as a scale-up and strategic advisor through Stratford Group, and working with a variety of industries and technologies, et cetera, helping companies in a wide range of activities, from financing restructuring to growth plans to board assessments, et cetera. The other part is that I've been fairly active. I work on the board of advisors with the Institute of Corporate Directors, and we provide education and support and certification actually for individuals wishing to become board members. And I sit today on 5 boards, variety of startup, larger ones, etc. And I've really migrated. 3 of those boards are female founders. And so when we talk about, kind of looking for what you're interested in and your kind of what kind of moves you and motivates you, the board positions I've taken have been with female founders, because I think that is really an area that I think we can see a lot of potential and growth and opportunity. And same as with SheBoot, I love supporting kind of both entrepreneurs, but also 2 female founders. So happy to be here and happy to be part of SheBoot again.
Thanks. I'm Kerry. I work with Donna under the governance boutique, and which she already covered. And I work with aspiring directors on getting them trained on LinkedIn. I've worked with enterprise organizations on training their global sales teams on LinkedIn. And so this is now putting sort of a lens. If you're a board director, how can you present yourself online? And I'm also an advisor with Invest Ottawa. So my background is in marketing and supporting marketing and sales. I've worked within startups and with startups and all the way up to enterprise companies. So yeah, a lot of vast experience sector wise as well as company size wise. So we will get going.
That's great. So always have to have a goal. So we have sort of very high level ones today, governance, an overview of both corporate board and good governance, the differences between corporate and advisory board, which one do you need, when do you need it, and then broadly on maintaining investor support and alignment. I'd like to say before we really get too much into it, we want to be as interactive as possible. So maybe I don't have my screen set up properly. I can't see everybody, but I'm happy if people lean in, or Katie, if you want to raise your hand or thumb and stop us at any point. Likewise, Kim and Kerry. Kim and I've done this enough. We feed off each other. Kerry, can lean in too. So we want to make it as interactive and informative as possible, but cover some content that I think will be really valuable to you. So with that, we'll begin. So I think before the title of this is, you have the money, now what, or what's next? So one thought, and Kim and I have talked about this a lot, is, ideally before taking the money, you've done some due diligence in the sense that you've considered, what type of investor you want. Does it match your stage? You understand their personal backgrounds, their reputations of investors, of potential board members, potential, there's often a lot going on. You want to check, what their history is with funds and fund building. Maybe spoke to some of the founders they've worked with. You've done some research, whatever you can find out online. There's a lot of content available. You've talked to maybe some other, as I said, companies they've worked with, but also maybe those boards that they've served or other board members they've served with. So I think it's really important. Kim and I Kim, I think you said it right, growing up in sort of the boom of the tech sector, where some of the things I saw with, the very, very flush and free flows of capital into ideas, that was very, very dynamic, I think is a nice word. It wasn't always functional in the outcome. There was a lot of dysfunction. There was a lot of, capital that vaporized because it wasn't managed well, those sorts of things. But I would stress the importance, and one of the key lessons I took away from that is that founders need to be very, very selective on who they take money from. Kim, you might want to comment further on that.
Yeah, so I've taken money from a lot of different parties and a lot of different VCs and investors in my career. I've probably spoke, I don't even know how many I have. I mean, I kind of gauged maybe 200 plus VCs or investors over my career, maybe even more, but the they're not all created equal. And I think that the different stage of companies requires a different type of investor. And you have to be careful what you wish for. So money may seem available and good, but the terms and the associated support and the expectations are really important. And I'll give you one example or one point, is that doing the research, as Donna said, on the funds or the potential investors is important, because if you get an investment from a fund that's near its end of life, you know they're going to push for only one of two things, either an exit or another financing with a big secondary so they can close out that fund. And that becomes it puts you in a very kind of tenuous position, because you have an investor who's got a goal different than yours in terms of growing the company. So making sure you have that goal alignment, and also to the expectation in terms of level of support.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't think that we can overemphasize that point, and that's why we start with that slide. So some of you may have taken money and hopefully have taken some of the advice we've just shared. And for those of you who are embarking on that, and I suppose She-Boot is falls into the category of an ideal or good investor, there's a lot of support surrounding their investment. So, but it is very important. But we'll now get into sort of the topic of the day is governance. And I've, as I said, over probably 40 years plus, heard so many definitions of governance, and I've distilled it down in it is the power to oversee and influence the control and direction of something. So if you think of governance, it is a power. It has there's a lot of oversight attributed to that role, and it gives you kind of a lot of influence as well. The goal in my mind is that governance should always be about efficient and effective value-added activities. And that's what sort of achieves what I'll differentiate governance from good governance and board governance and corporate governance. So the question I think I would ask, and people ask me, it was like, especially founders and especially startups, well, like, why do I care? I'm so small. Because governance was always kind of perceived to be in the domain of public companies. It was in their purview, or complex institutions like banks and universities. So little startups and emerging companies were like, well, why does it matter? But governance became a very big and important topic, probably 20 plus years ago. And that was triggered by malfeasance, I'll call it, or drama in public companies. So it's certainly, failures aren't, always in the domain of public companies, but the media reports of when public companies fail becomes a very rich topic for dissecting, and it also has huge economic and social impact. So, and in many cases, the studies that followed some of those bigger failures, and I think we have a younger audience, but Enron, Nortel, WorldCom, there were a bunch of very, very well publicized failures that generated a lot of study, lawsuits, all kinds of things. So the findings really were that in some cases, the corporate institution to which society gave power to do and fulfill an idea failed. It failed in its constitution and accountability to people. It failed to conduct their operations according to a code of ethics or morals, and it produced very, very undesirable results. So at a micro level, how does that happen? Well, it can be illegitimate uses of power and authority without any sort of counterbalance of accountability. Accountability is a word you'll hear a lot in governance. Though it could be a conflict amongst shareholders, amongst management and shareholders or stakeholders, or it can be because of impotent boards, and impotent is the right word, because I think I've researched some of the failures and the boards were window dressing and nothing more. Ego clashes, self-interest and personalities, political and legal infighting. We could go on and on and on, but the consequences are tragic and horribly, in my mind. It's a really sad loss of and destruction of capital. So employees are affected, creditors, suppliers, the entire communities lose careers and savings, and it just puts society's hopes and a lot of media attention against private enterprise as well. So it's very significant. What that triggered about 20 years ago were massive studies around the globe. In Canada, we have a report that's called the Day Report, and it was appropriately titled, Where Were the Directors? So, you know, and Nortel was a classic of you know, what happened here. Cadbury report in the UK, and in the US, you'll hear of something called Sarbanes-Oxley, which exists to this day. So what it triggered were new laws and regulations, many commissions of inquiries, there's been many books written. So it's essential in my mind and very opportunistic for directors and CEOs, who I believe most of you as founders will be, just rise to the challenge of good governance. And in my mind, I go back to it, well, it's about decision making, but it's about behavior. So, and I think also from that sort of aura of now compliance, especially in the public company domain, which I think ideally as a private enterprise, you get to mature with governance and you get to make mistakes and failures and build something of value before you become public. I worked at a company, and Kim knows this, called Newbridge, and we, over a 5-year period, I think, created 25 or so affiliates, all new, sort of new enterprises. And one of the attributes of the models, we said, behave how you want to be when you grow. So if you want to be a public company, have a functional board, have committees. It doesn't have to be robust and complicated, but reflect the behavior of sorry, your excuse me, organizational goal. I'm going to need a quick drink, sorry. So what we did see, and I think we can all attest to this, is that sort of more I made predictions about how this would affect, you know, business, enterprise, and corporations became more familiar with their corporate social responsibility. I think most of you've probably heard of CER, and that means aligning and integrating a business model that it reflects the concepts of a corporate conscience, corporate citizenship, social performance, and suitable responsible businesses in a corporate mandate of responsible business. So I think that's been sort of a good shift. And I think it's something that startups can embrace. There's many debates over other solutions. You know, do we need more liability, et cetera, attributed to directors? I think what we need, and the root of it all, is behavior. And I think from the lens of a corporation as a generator of sort of economic and social well-being and good, we need to understand governance, we need to understand the system of governance, and we need to know how boards in particular work. And that's part of our mission today. And let's do it so we're not triggering more transformational changes that will penetrate into the private capital markets and make it more onerous for entrepreneurs. So that, in a nutshell, is why we care about governance and doing governance well. Kim, you may have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think it does start with the mindset of, you know, making sure that you are working towards the well-being of the corporation. And governance really does boil down to that, is that, and we'll get into more details in terms of deciding on advisory boards or selecting your boards, but having that kind of shared thought would have probably got rid of a lot of the issues associated with these, you know, the big catastrophes at Nortel, et cetera. Versus either the egos or independent thought process of some of those board directors. So I think that keeping governance in the forefront and making sure you start off on the right foot is good, because if you don't, it's very hard to unwind it. I know from experience on boards I've been on where there's been poor governance, it's very, very challenging to unwind it and change the mindset. And in one case, I left the board because of it. So I think that starting off on the right foot is good. It's not hard, but it's a mindset. So
that's good and speaks to behavior. I think it offers a great opportunity to build value. So, and doing that is making sure everyone's clear on the roles and responsibilities, sort of the interdependencies and how it sort of operates together, and builds on, sort of complementary strengths of your board, your management, and your investors, and, everyone shares the same success. So I've decided a while ago, because I would often
sorry, there's a question, a hand up with Sophia.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah.
Sorry.
I don't know if we're going to discuss this later, but so you mentioned like this importance of starting with the right foot, and so I'm wondering, as in my case, as solo founder, so I don't have a board, that I essentially make all decisions. Is there anything that I should be doing or considering right now to start on the right foot, as you mentioned?
Do you want to go first, Kim, or?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment on that. I think it's, I think understanding the landscape of where you want to evolve to, you've got a strategic plan, you've got a plan of where you want to grow your company to. I think making sure that you keep the governance discussion or the governance thought process in as part of your strategic planning, your long-term planning is important, because you may not have a board today, but as you when we talked earlier about getting the right investors, they're going to want to see it on your board. So you need to, understand what are the, what's the part of it's the culture of your organization and the culture you want to instill on your board. So I think that knowing where you want to go with your company is really going to mean where you want to go with your board and your governance when you set it up. So I think it's just make sure that you are purposely thinking about how you want to, what type of board you want, what type of framework or discussion or individuals, and we'll talk later about an advisory versus a kind of corporate board. And so people tend to evolve into it, but evolving into it with the same principles, I guess. So Donna, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything Kim has said, and I just add that it's about people, and I'm sure as a founder you're thinking, you need people on your leadership team, people on your maybe executive leadership team, you need investors. So there's all components of individuals and human stakeholders that you need, and boards in particular is a component that will tie with an investment, typically, as Kim said, in the early stages. So thinking about the qualities, not of just the competencies and functional attributes that that individual or that investor, but the behavioral ones. I can't stress that enough. And
Thank you.
so those would be my high level. So are there any other before we move on? We're good, Katie? Okay. So I've broken down corporate board and good governance, because people say them, and I used to say, well, no, that's board governance. So we've already said, the framework of corporate governance broadly is the way and conditions under which decisions are made. Board governance is really the people who exercise fiduciary duty, influence, direct, or control that decision making in an organization. And good governance is sort of the overall system. So and that's internal as well as external, but for new companies and private companies, it's the internal system. So, how board work gets done, processes, practices, and, policy framework that builds the culture and fulfills the mandate. So good governance is, I just say in a broad sense, is the system of governance that you adopt and approach, and you have rules and you have some protocols and practices for conducting your affairs that work towards good governance. We'll get more on that later, but really when we're talking a lot today about board governance. So we can flip to the next. So this is an illustration of the evolution sort of from a governance lens or governance viewpoint. So you'll see across the top, we have, company in a seed, startup, early stage expansion. And then we've broken out sort of the key sort of constituents in a governance sense, and that would be your shareholders and stakeholders. So who provide funding, your board who manages that funding, basically, or that enterprise, and then the management employees. So if we just go down the seed column, you're at the idea stage, you're very early, maybe proof of concept. Your shareholders are often your own money, maybe some family and friends. We often refer to it as love money. You have an idea and they give you some money and off you go. The board itself is usually just the founders, maybe a family member, maybe a friend. And the board work is, I call it ceremonial. Your lawyers will tell you once or twice a year, oh, you have to do this. And they prepare the minutes of a meeting you never actually hold, or resolutions. And I say that tongue in cheek. It's necessary and it keeps you compliant, but it's not really what I would call the rigor of a full blown board. The founders, you wear many hats, which I'm sure you do. Some, have all kinds of, might be CEOs and CIOs. It's all, you have very few, if any, employees. People are contracted and they work virtually. So that you can see is pretty simple. It's a pretty low risk in terms of governance, because it's going, if you fail as an investor or a founder in your idea, the whole thing sort of vaporizes. If it continues to grow, which usually starts with funding, then you'll bring in angels. So those could be high net worth individuals, it could be government funding, other tax credits, there could be some bank financing. I think that's very limited. And your board is becoming, we call it liberated from founders, because some of the angels may want board representation. Government, I just encountered where a government type funding agreement requires the organization to have an independent corporate director. So they don't mind that the founders are on the board, but they also want some independence. And I thought that was a very positive evolution in my mind. And, founders continue to do a lot of the senior management work. So I think those are the two that I think most of you at this stage would be focused on. And then it just gets bigger and different as it goes on. But pardon me, I have a really annoying frog in my throat this morning. So the founders, wear, as I said, many hats. They're really accountable for everything. So, as terms of the boardroom culture, it all falls to the founders. But what we see is that, a lot of paradox. So wearing those many hats, you're sort of just feeling your way through of, oh, is that a board duty, or is that, investor, whatever, and they just all merge together, and you're making very common sense decisions and feeling your way through it. And that's absolutely fine. But what will trigger when your board is, you go to that next stage of startup and you have independents or others coming on. And what I see is founders have very limited idea of what that individual's role is. And that's where confusion, and there's unclear leadership and accountability, and who has authority for what. So that's where governance is helpful. I think something worth mentioning here, Kim, and you hopefully agree, is often with the intake of funding at the startup stage, almost certainly at the earlier or later expansion stage, is you will have an agreement with your investors, and the agreement will, shareholders agreement, and they're often unanimous. So all your shareholders have the same rights. That it will also address some governance issues. So it may attribute board seats to those investors. That's all. I think this is as good a time as any, Kim, to talk about those kind of negotiations, because they're very attached to your funding. So if you don't understand sort of, you know, the what the model looks like, and you're going to know the model by the end of this, I think that you need to be savvy enough to understand the same sort of guidance we gave about choosing an investor. Now you think of that investor, and if that investor wants a board seat, what's that look like? You know, is that the person you want able to influence and control and direct how you're organizing? And if you think of it that way, you go, whoa, step back. And often the duties of a board in those early stages is, you know, kind of approving and leaning in on your strategic planning. CEO succession is probably number one. So they'll start, you know, they have a duty to sort of assess your performance, you know, ensure the sort of financial liquidity, some risk management, that sort of thing. So that starts coming into play when you take money to which a board role is attached, because it says, oh, the agreement might just say, well, we get with our investment 1 seat or 2, however, you know, there's a variety, endless variety of what they'll get. But people say, well, that's okay, I don't mind having you aboard. But you need to be mindful of what it means. And Kim, I've seen it. I've seen many just sign those agreements away, give those seats up, get these individuals, and then go, oh my, what have I done? So Kim, I'll let you speak on that too.
Yeah, I think that's probably the area where the diligence of that agreement with, when we talked earlier on about knowing who your investors are, kind of feeds into this as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a couple of things that, in addition to what Donna said, the risk is that if you have, you know, a lot of those shareholders agreements will say that they need to approve, you know, a whole variety of things up to, you know, a bank line, anything over $10,000. Well, that really hampers your ability to manage the company. So you've got to be really, really careful in terms of what is included in there, because it's not just the fact that you've taken the money and they're on your board, but the conditions associated with it could be really restrictive in terms of how you want to run your business and how you, and this kind of goes back to the discussion about the role of the board versus management. So I think that unfortunately, terms and rights that are embedded in your first agreement, shareholders agreement, are very hard to get rid of. And they tend to follow, and they become almost a pile-on impact with the next round of funding you get. The investor is going to say, well, you gave them this, I want that plus. And so now it becomes a very, very complicated and could be challenging pile-on effect about the rights and obligations. And it goes from the whole realm of they're only going to take prefs, and they're going to take prefs with, you know, high multiples of conversion. Well, the next guy's going to want higher, and the next guy's going to want higher. So I think you really have to be, I would say, hard-nosed with your first investment of limiting the amount of kind of board control over day-to-day operations. Because again, it's like the, you know, lowest common denominator, the first one, it's going to get worse. So Linda has a question, I think.
Yes, sorry, and I'm not going to turn my screen on because I'm in a car moving, but
No problem.
this is a really interesting conversation because I didn't realize, like, as a founder, I always thought, you know, if I can control the majority ownership, then I would maintain control. But it's actually the board control that is like really important, and it was
100%.
it was like mind-blowing for me that I hadn't even considered that. But that aside, what I was curious about is, we have a formal board, the two, like myself and my co-founder, and we have one board member who we trust and we have a long-term relationship with, but we also have a more informal advisory board, just to kind of leverage more skill sets. I'm just wondering, does that ever have to, like, can we keep, like, what's the best practice there? Because I feel like we're kind of writing the rules as we go, and I'm not sure if we're, what's the best practice there?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to talk about that as we go through in terms of advisory boards, but for sure, advisory boards are super powerful and very important and can be very, very helpful. So I think that it's really the definition of what you want them to do, which is a critical part, not the fact you have one. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just one thing going back, Linda, it's not the board, it's what's in your shareholders agreement and which is really important, and the board will execute on that. So You've got, Donna's going to talk about like the bylaws, the shareholder agreement, etc. Those dictate what the roles and responsibilities are of the board versus management. And particularly in that shareholders agreement that you have, that's going to say you may only have 3 people on the board, but if the shareholders agreement says all shareholders have to approve, I'll use something kind of totally extreme, but all shareholders have to have, it has to be a unanimous shareholder approval of opening a new bank account. That's an extreme, but it could happen. And I've seen it happen in terms of a bank account outside of Canada, as an example. I've seen that before. So you have to be really, really careful in terms of reading it, deciding where, the point in which you think it's not manageable for your organization, which again goes back to our first slide, understanding that, what the investor wants and making sure that you're kind of pretty directed in terms of what you want.
Mm-hmm. It's actually refreshing to hear someone, I think you said your name's Linda, that you appreciate, oh wait, it's the shareholder, the investor puts money in, but they exercise their influence through the board. And that's that. If you've got that takeaway cleared in and crystallized in your mind, I think that's a really good start. We'll move on, unless there's any more questions on this. This is a slide I don't know, I'm quite proud of it. I've used it many times and I've done whole sessions on just this slide. So this is basically the contemporary corporate entity in the universe, and pretty much globally there's some variations in boards. Some have supervisory boards in certain countries, but this is pretty much the model. So if we drill down into the center, we see it starts with a legal charter. So you've all probably incorporated, had your lawyers do that. And the concept, I'm not a lawyer, I have lots of experience in law, and I understand these concepts, but the legal charter that, we have provincial statutes and we have a federal one that give anyone the right to apply and create a corporation. Name it what you want and structure it, but it has, in every one of them must have a shareholder, must have directors, and often the statutes refer to them as officers, but those 3 constituencies are pretty much, with a little variation in board structure, universal around the globe. And the legal charter actually attributes the rights and privileges of an individual to that entity. So the law doesn't say, well, you can and can't do certain things. You are subject to the same rights and accountabilities as an individual. There are some laws that impact certain corporations in certain areas of operation, but by and large, I'm speaking very generally. So you start with shareholders or investors in codes, the corporate codes or law calls them shareholders, but investors, it's the same term. And their fundamental right, to Linda's point, it's to appoint auditors if you are at the thresholds that you need to appoint an auditor, and to elect directors. So those are the big. Now, shareholders by law have a number of other statutory voting rights. So if you want to sell your business, you want to acquire or amalgamate with another, you want to dissolve it, you want to wind it down. So I call them very big ticket impact structural changes. Usually the law articulates when shareholders vote on that. And, all of you will have lawyers who guide you, say, we want to merge with this company. They lay out the process. So, but ideally the shareholders are represented, that's the word, by the directors they elect. So the directors are the ones that, back to the definition, control, influence, direct the operation. And directors then delegate down further to management and appoint officers. Officers then, employees, they can retain consultants and advisors, it's this is just a model. Boards carry out their work through committees. They'll also retain consultants as advisors. So that big picture in the center there is kind of the enterprise, or your organization or your legal structure. I'm not sure how best to describe it, but that's the corporation model based on corporate statutes. Then the rings around are the influence you have in the world, like your entity, and depends on the size. It might just be, a small business in the corner store might be incorporated. It has the same model, obviously much less complexity, to, a organization that has 60,000 shareholders. They follow the same model. Then you have stakeholders, and stakeholders, we'll talk a little bit about that, has been also become a better influence in terms of boards' decision making, is considering the impact of decisions on customers, vendors, communities, that sort of thing. Those have been tested in case laws, and say, oh, boards, but you actually do have to take into consideration, and we've codified that in our federal corporate law, that stakeholders they don't go so far to say how you do it, but they say you should take stakeholder impacts into consideration. Then there's governance. We all know we've got to follow legislation. Sometimes it's administrative justice, it's local, provincial. There's lots of rules to follow from sort of a government point of view. And then now, of course, the environment, political, economic, social. So many factors impact organization. It's not getting less complex, more. I don't want to ever scare anyone with this, but this is sort of the best way I know to sort of illustrate how, you're structured at the beginning. And this model has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's been challenged, it's been tested, well, we got to get rid of it. It's not the model. That's why I go back to behavior. So I don't know how much I could talk about the history of why it came. It just separated, and how did founders and owners separate? Well, it was because you had multiple founders, you had multiple investors, and you can't have 50, 60 people trying to make decisions. So that's how boards became sort of that fiduciary body initially to represent the interests of shareholders, which is why they elect them. Now under shareholders, you could almost, it's not codified strict enough yet in law, say shareholders, stakeholders, because their impact. I don't know if that'll ever happen. So it's, I think I mentioned, you regard the corporation as a person. It can be charged, it can be penalized, it can be convicted like a person. The owner's liability or the shareholder liability is very limited, basically, to what it is invested. But directors will, there's a little brighter lens around the director in the model. They're the ones that are held to account for malfeasance and crime, basically. Kim, I can see you shaking. Do you want to add?
I would say the only other one is just in terms of maybe comparing, Donna, the kind of, and very briefly, the difference between Canadian governance and in terms of acting for the corporation as an entity,
right.
versus in the US. There's still, you will read things where their view is you're acting for the shareholder. Right. And I think it's a very different perspective in terms of the behavior. And I only bring this up because I've worked in both a US company and in Canadian companies. It's a very different relationship with your shareholders and your board and your investors. So just be aware of, if you are bringing in board members or you are a US board or investors from the US, they may have a different governance landscape or lens than it would be in Canada.
Yeah, very, very good point. That would be the only
kind of comment I would make.
Yeah, very, very good point. There are definitely, I would say, in a high level, and anecdotally, that Canada governs largely by, here's what you should comply with, and if you don't, you get an opportunity to explain why you did it and what you did, and that's okay. Whereas in the US, your accountability is very wired into investors and what investor expectations, less, not codified as far as I know at all, although there is, you know, it's a very big melting pot in the US, so some states may vary and are more liberal about that it involves stakeholders and CSR, like I think California companies and Silicon Valley has embraced that more, like what I would call a more Canadian model. So it will fare very jurisdictionally, but what has evolved definitely in Canada and through case law and settlement of, you know, judicial decisions is that stakeholders now you do have some accountability. I don't know that it's been tested like yet, but that's a good point. Any questions on this? Yeah, okay. Exciting, isn't it? Okay, board power and duty. So we've talked a lot about board. We sort of gave the definition. And basically, board power and duty breaks down into, you know, the board duty, the fiduciary duty. I've worked very hard to make this sort of plain English and not sound overly legalistic. But as I said at the beginning, every corporation must have a board. It could be one person in a private company, and it can be the founder. Also, the law codifies in a very, very broad sense the overarching duty. So the main board duty is to, and I can quote this, to manage and supervise the management of the corporation. So it'll be defined in varying degrees that way in all codes, not just in Canada, but around the world. So that the power and authority of the board and its duty comes right from law. So fiduciary duty, then the law further says, well, you know, as a fiduciary, you have a duty, duty to act honestly, in good faith, with a view to the best interest of the corporation. And I think it's very, very key here that the corporation's interests have to be paramount in exercising board duty. So, and Kim, we probably could tell many stories about where people have acted in self-interest on a board instead of the best interest of the board, but we'll save the stories. You also, the law sort of says you have a duty of confidentiality, you have to avoid and manage conflicts of interest, and you have a duty to disclose. So the duty of care is really a standard that the law, it's a very, very practical standard. You have to exercise care, diligence, and skill of a reasonably prudent person as they would act in similar or comparable circumstances. So it's not a high, like you have to be an expert, you have to have a PhD. It's not, it's a reasonable person test. So when directors are challenged on fulfillment of a duty of care, it's exercised against that sort of code, which has been interpreted by many legal people. Exercise the care, due diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise. Okay, so what does it all mean? Next slide. It means you're going to, in fiduciary duty, you're going to be honest, you're going to tell the truth, you're going to be loyal to the corporation and avoid conflicts of interest, whether they're real or perceived. Your duty is to protect the corporation, not yourself. The duty of care, you want to, the reasonable person test, be appropriately informed. You would need to be, you know, capable and fair and aware. You're diligent, you follow board agreed processes, you become and you stay and remain informed, very important. You have skills and experience. You're not expected to be an expert, but you commit to learning. And you're prudent, you're careful, and you're deliberate, you're cautious, you apply your knowledge, your professionalism, your tact. So that's kind of, to me, really condenses nicely sort of what the attributes of a director are in terms of a practical interpretation of a fiduciary duty and a duty of care and confidentiality. So those are sort of the high level. Do you want to go to the next one? So the attributes, sorry, I love this quote. That gave sort of the legal overview. I've always been very passionate about value added contribution. So you get good people who don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal on your board, but how are they going to add value? So you aren't concerned about their ethics, their integrity, and their energy, which I do believe are very threshold sort of attributes that you want in any director and probably any investor. But we want to sort of how do they add value? And value to me is character, and character's somewhat codified based on sort of the reasonableness of the individual and the overarching duty, but the attributes and competencies aren't sort of articulated in law. So to add value, you want individuals who are going to advance your business evolution, not sort of your governance or fiduciary. You want them to be able to perform in that domain, but they're going to provide strategic insights and experience, both with authenticity and commitment. And I can't emphasize enough in my mind how it's character that will differentiate the functionality and the value added attributes of your board. Because when character's bad, life is very bad. So Kim, you want to maybe talk some more about value add? Because I think I mentioned earlier sort of the value added kind of duties that flow from fiduciary are strategic planning, CEO succession, risk management, financial, but beyond those are valuable in fulfilling fiduciary duty. But how would you define sort of value added attributes of a board director?
I think that the again, being able to look above their individual experience set, but being able to apply it to the landscape of the company that they are serving on as a board of directors. I think I'll talk about what probably doesn't work and what does work. So putting people on your board who only know your subject and don't have a broad range of experience is not necessarily a good thing. It may be good early on, but they will try, it has a very limiting impact in terms of being able to advise you on the broader strategic landscape. So I think the couple of things that I would say that work best is people have a broad range of experience. The integrity part is super important and very, very critical. I think the ability to listen and being able to appreciate and be respectful of other directors and of management. You don't want directors who are heavy-handed, that I'm coming in here, I've worked as a managing partner in an accounting firm for 40 years and therefore I know everything. That does not work. You have to be able to distill your broad range of experience, but also listen and be respectful of other people around the table and of management. So when you're picking your directors, I think that we talked a little bit about culture, character, etc. That weighs in a lot, because you don't want to be just hiring the Nobel Prize winner or the 40-year audit partner or the managing partner of a law firm because they provide prestige on your board. They may not provide and be able to distill or support you in that wheel of activity, because they may not have the scope of understanding or be able to scale into your business and your strategy. So they have to fit your business today, your business tomorrow, and to be able to, again, look at it from a broad perspective. So that would be my 2 cents.
That's really good insight. I read something recently, or I listened to it on a podcast, I'm not sure, but someone was advocating the idea that some of the most highly skilled generalists make the best board directors.
Mhm.
That you don't actually need expertise in anything. You need really solid experience, I think, as Kim said,
Yeah.
maybe in different domains than you're in, but or different verticals, but somehow complement where it is you want to go. And usually, if you look forward in your strategic plan, you see, sort of what attributes and value added contributions you could gain from a board that align with those objectives.
Mhm.
And then sort of make your recruitment efforts, if that's what you're doing, sort of to those functionalities and character competencies. So
Yeah.
does anyone have any questions on building the board? Nope. Nope. Okay.
Donna, I'm thinking on that note, right now would be a great time to take a break
Perfect.
because we're about an hour in. Give people 5 minutes, 5 minutes to stretch, look
That's great.
outside, off the screen, all that
Yeah.
good stuff. Okay, so I'll start the timer in about 10 seconds. Everyone just go take 5 minutes. If you want to eat, if you want to get another coffee, please do that. Feel free to do that during the session. Okay. Okay, folks, our 5 minutes is up. Welcome back. Welcome back.
I thought you said 10 minutes.
Oh, we can take if we want to take an
Oh,
extra
no,
5 minutes. Okay.
it's fine with me. I thought you had said 10, so people might not be back yet.
Oh, did I say 10? I'm so sorry.
I don't know. I
Maybe
thought
my
maybe
brain
I
is
did. Yeah, I don't
maybe my
know.
brain is out to lunch. It's
Yeah.
week 6. So,
Yeah. Oh,
but if
my
you are
fridge is,
grabbing, oh, I was just gonna say if people are grabbing snacks or coffee
yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever, but you can bring them on screen. That's completely fine.
yeah.
It's lunchtime, I know. The people are
Mhm.
busy. Ready for people to slowly come back.
Mhm. My fridge is being delivered.
Right now?
Yeah. Can you hear it? I hope
Nope.
not.
Nope, the sound is great.
Carrie
So
said she heard me snap my fingers because my friend turned off his phone, so he didn't get my text. So I had to get his
oh,
attention by snapping my fingers.
you gotta do what you gotta do.
You do. You do.
Oh, here we go. Okay, people are gradually coming back. Dawn, just so that you know your camera is still off, just so you're aware, if unless it's a choice, that works. It's just I always, the mute, the camera, all those things I'm always forgetting. I did want to let everybody know, we're well aware that this session is really content heavy. It's a lot of information to process at once, a lot of graphs, a lot of details. Donna and I, when she was going through the slides a couple of days ago or yesterday, she was saying, I realize this is a very busy slide, and normally this is not how I would present, but as a resource to refer back to, it's there and available for you. So when as this is relevant now and becomes more and more relevant for you, you have that access through the founder share folder. I've already uploaded the slides there. So just so that all of you know, we realize that and recognize it's a lot of details. But on that note, I'll hand it over back to our workshop leads. And if anybody has any questions or comments, obviously interject. And I'm available in the chat too.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for pointing that out, because I often feel like a workshop and not sort of putting the fire hose down everyone's throat and saying, here's all the things you have to know, and here's what you have to. So, I think we'll wrap it up with some very sort of sensible, I know Kim and I are both sort of try to be very practical about things, but there's some concepts you need to know. And I think that are important to know and will help you, today as you're building your business, but into the future. So with that, we'll skip to the next slide, how a board makes decisions. And there's some really important concepts here. So you'll see, trying to be cute here, we sort of early stage, sort of what a board meeting might look like versus, later stage where you're actually, at the table. So regardless, it's still a board, it's still a meeting, and you still are there to make decisions or to add value, a combination. So the first concept is that it is the collective body of directors is referred to as the board of directors, and the board of directors operates as a unit. So just let that sit for a minute. That means that no individual director can cause the corporation to take any sort of distinct action unless the board itself authorizes and directs a particular director to do so, which never happens. So the decisions that come out of boards are out of that collective unit with all those people. And I think that's important to know. The second concept is that each director at a board table is equal in terms of power and authority. And that includes nominee directors. So we didn't use the word nominee directors, and I apologize for that. When Kim and I were talking about negotiating in a shareholders agreement, and an investor says, well, I'll give you my money, but I want a board seat. That individual is often referred to as a nominee director because he is nominated by that investor to serve on your board. So that's all that means. So at the board table, everyone's equal, all directors equal in terms of power, and they have to be free to sort of exercise their authority and discretion unimpeded by their obligations to the shareholders, who could be their employer, and other stakeholders. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Kim, or maybe I'll finish and then we can dig down a little deeper.
No, that's fine.
Okay, and a board generally reaches its decisions and by which all directors agree to be bound, even if they're not really liking it or in strong favor of the decision, they've agreed to live with it. And so it's pretty fundamental that all members of the board are bound by consensus. So in practicality, that means, in reality, 3, 4, 5-member board, different points of view on different things, they reach a decision. It's important that, and I've seen this behavior, which is why I mention it, and any board I work with, that they don't go outside the boards and say, oh, well, I didn't agree with that decision. Oh, I was totally against that, but you act as if it's consensus, whether you like it or not. There are mechanisms in law for directors to dissent against a decision if they feel that strongly and they get their dissent recorded. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've followed up with board members who had strong views against a direction, but they didn't want to exercise dissent. And me asking the question sort of reinforced to them, then you've agreed with this decision. Keep it very black and white. And whatever other conversations happen in the boardroom, it doesn't matter. So that was another important concept. So all directors are bound by the decision of the board, and usually a majority is all that is needed to pass a decision or approve a matter at a board level. The reality is they always try to go for unanimity or full consensus on the decision. And the best way, in my experience, because a lot of you will sit on these boards with that constituency as founders or CEOs, the best way, in my view, to resolve disputes amongst board members is just dialogue. And, no end running, no outside the boardroom. You force yourself to sit down and come to a decision on a matter. So this is the last point I'll make. Decisions made by a board are a question of business judgment that is exercised in the best interest of the corporation. So go back to the point I said, they're not expected to be experts, make perfect decisions, make right decisions all the time. They have to make it in the exercise of their fiduciary duty and all those qualities and attributes we talked about. But their decisions are analyzed in a legal sense as a matter of business judgment. They're never exercised that way, only if there is malfeasance. So it's I don't know if I'm clouding or confusing that. Kim, does that make sense to you, what I'm saying?
Yep, it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how decisions are made, it's a really vital component of a director's duty. So you have to sort of design your board operations in a way that enhances that component of a director's duty. And remember that boards are assessed on the process, not necessarily on the decision. So if a board is sued or a company is sued, what the law looks at is how they came about. Did they exercise fiduciary duty to that decision, or did they just kind of cavalier about it? So that's why behavior is so important. They have to be diligent. They have to demonstrate diligence as a reasonable person. Some of the, and I'll use an example, I think you may not know, but in one situation of failure, the CEO was so powerful, so influential, was friends with everybody on the board, that they didn't even probably read or ask for materials or exercise any kind of diligence. So, but they were all accountable for it. So when, you know, it became a front page item, it was all the board, even, and they had no defense, because I actually got some of the transcripts from the court order. They hadn't even had a meeting. They just kind of informally agreed and let the CEO run and run. So we've improved a lot since then, but I think process is really, really important. Process is more important sometimes than the decisions, because you're going to be assessed on how you made it and what diligence and how you applied your fiduciary duty, as opposed to what you actually decided, if that makes sense. So I'm sorry, can anyone hear noise in the background?
Yes,
I think
you may want to
I think
ask
it's your
them to just
fridge.
talk.
Bear with me 1
Yeah,
minute. I
No
apologize.
problem.
So one thing I'll add to that is that what happens a lot early stage is that the information sharing between management and the board becomes very fluid. But if you're going to ask the board to make a decision on a topic, you need to make sure you provide them with the right relevant information to do it. And a good board director will make sure they have that information to make the decision. So it's not, I would say that I wouldn't be offended if someone says, I don't have all the information, can you give me this?
Yeah.
Because it's just, it will be a learning curve with early stage companies. There's a tendency to overload a board with too much information versus information that's relevant to the decisions they're making.
Good point. And we'll talk a little more on sort of those components of decision making. So so the other one more thing before that slide, Carrie, is there are really two methods that you can seek or obtain a board decision or board approval. One is by written resolution, and one is by a motion passed at a meeting. So those are the only two ways. So conversations, email, Skype phone calls, Zoom phone calls, that you agree on something is you have to formalize the decision either in writing, in a written resolution. And a written resolution means you don't have to have a meeting, but you all your directors have to sign it, all of them. I've seen some say, well, it's only a majority and they want to bypass two that are against it. You need them all, or you need to call a meeting. So for a meeting, and this is, also important in startups, and where many sort of, I wouldn't say fail, but are challenged, is there has to be a notice. And this is sort of a matter of law now, a notice, a quorum, a chair. There has to be a question posed in the form of a motion. There has to be a vote held. And that's pretty much it. Like, it doesn't have to be that your group on the right, the left of, I guess, your screen on early stage. It doesn't have to look like a courtroom. It doesn't have to look like, a formal proceeding, like maybe the left is a bit, but you have to have, been given proper notice, that you have a quorum, that everybody's there, that all your board understands what's being asked of them in terms of a decision, and it's framed, and then they vote on it. So meetings by phone, electronic is all permitted under most corporate statutes, and they're generally valid, provided all the directors have consented in advance to hold the meeting that way, and they can hear each other. And once it's approved, a resolution is, once a motion at a meeting's been called, is called a resolution, and resolutions get recorded in your minutes or your corporate records, which for most of you, 99% of you, that'll be through with your lawyers. Resolutions, as I said, can be passed outside of meetings. It's only effective if all your directors. Shareholders also can decide things by resolution. And it was really just designed to be a more efficient way for boards to fulfill their duty than calling meetings with all the formality around it. So in the absence of a written resolution, you can only have it done by a formal meeting in which they exercise their rights. So that sounds like a lot. If you just remember, I get them all in writing. Everybody's signature has to be on it. It becomes legally effective when the last person signs, and or you have a meeting of your board. And lots of companies in early stage use a combination of both.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So, I've asked this before in a separate workshop. You know, in Shark Tank, we see this where they mention advisory shares provided to the investors. So do advisory shares mean that those particular investors now get a seat at the table, like they're part of the board?
Not necessarily. No. And Shark Tank's US, so they'll use a little different terminology. I think what they mean by advisory shares is that they will be an advisor, and instead of you paying them cash, you'll give them some equity. I think that's all that would mean. Kim, do you have a different? Yeah.
No, and I mean, I think it's, you can give a lot of people shares, whether it's payment for services, you can give them, you know, a payment in equity shares, but they're shareholders of the company, but they don't have to be on your board of directors. So they still will be shareholders.
Okay.
And then in a Shark Tank scenario, I'll just add to that. They believe they are a high value as an advisor to you and to your enterprise, and that they're offering their services for equity. So it's seen as like, I'm not going to deplete your cash because I'd be way too expensive for you, but I'll challenge your cap table instead.
Yeah.
That's
Sylvia, I think Sylvia has a question as well.
Yeah.
I do. I thought I would jump in and ask a question. It's not it's kind of related, I guess, to advisor and a board member. So same as you would choose an advisor based on the people that you have met or were introduced, and you see that this is a good fit, and now you're looking for a board member. What are some other ways you could seek out the right board member for your organization? Like if you haven't met this person yet, like what are some other ways that you can recommend?
So I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you saying, how do I find a board member?
Yeah. So if I were to look, if I were to look for, yes, if I were to look for obviously a strategic board member that would add value to my organization, but I don't have that specific person yet and I haven't met them, how would I find one?
Yeah. So
you want to go, Donna?
I'll go.
Start.
That is some of the work we do. So you articulate your need, and you know, you don't need to hire, you know, a very high priced recruitment firm to find. Networking is still, I think, you know, what's important is define. Okay, so we could do a whole session on this, but you want to first articulate sort of the competencies, functional competencies you want. So you mentioned you tie it to your strategic plan, see what you already have in your board, identify the gaps, and then specifically target for those competencies and those skills. LinkedIn, we've done this for an organization, that they can do a lot of this themselves. They've been liberated from very, very expensive recruiting firms, and there's smaller ones as well. But and then it's an interview process. It's like any recruitment, but you're recruiting for very specific skills, expertise, character. You do all the same kinds of integrity checks for that individual. But
that's helpful. And maybe this is sort of a second question. So let's say you find this ideal individual, you have your criteria. Are you going to touch on compensation, maybe a little bit later on a presentation?
Yeah, so compensation in private companies is, so I'll give you a very sort of anecdotal high level view of it. Within private companies, and maybe not at the earlier seed stages, but certainly as a merging and growth stage, if nominee directors generally are never paid or compensated by the board, they serve on because they are paid by their investor fund or whoever. Likewise, executive members, founders who sit on are compensated in some way. Generally in private companies is only independent corporate directors. So they're neither executive, neither investor, or they could be investor. That's a different conversation. That compensation is typically a combination of cash and equity, and that's a negotiated. There's some good data now through surveys of private companies on sort of compensation ranges for private company directors and independent. The ones I've worked with are generally, they're fairly substantial private companies. So they're, 50, 100 million sort of frame in revenue. So they can afford it. And if you're below that, but want to sort of build a board, you might settle it with equity and often options. Or Kim, you probably have some experience with that too. I'm giving sort of very generalized answer here, but
Yeah,
for
very
early stage, it could be equity.
Yeah, I would
options.
say it's very rare that you would have to pay cash
Mhm.
compensation to an independent director. It's typically
Early.
either early, yeah, it's either equity or options that vest over a 1-year term, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So, if you're looking for an independent director at an early stage and they're requesting kind of lump sum, like both dollars and equity, it's too rich for the stage of the company. So it will evolve. I mean, they will typically, you'll give them options or equity, either one. As you evolve, you get into your Series A or a couple series of financing, the issues become more complex. That's when cash compensation becomes a little bit more relevant, but early stage, either options vesting over a year or equity, one of the two.
Till you've sort of hit some high growth
Right,
markers.
exactly. Yeah.
Then a combination can kick in, to Kim's point.
Correct.
Sometimes it's
Yeah.
meeting fees. There's an endless array
there's-
of sort of structures
Yeah,
I've
if
seen.
you sit on a committee or if you're chair of a committee, there's a whole pile of parameters, but early stage, very rarely would you need to pay, or you should not pay a cash component.
No, most
Okay, thank you.
any that want
makes
early
sense, or-
stage roles, they'll settle for equity.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions on how board makes decisions? Okay, so we can go. Good segue into the next slide is, well, we've kind of, that these are impacts. Kim touched on information. So if you kind of think of these 8 things, when you want to build your board, composition, who's on it. I think we've kind of hammered home those points. Information flows. So you have to remember, think of yourself as a founder. None of you, I assume, work 9 to 5. And if you do, well, that's good for you. But you're day to day in it. Whereas your board might in total put in 100 hours a year. But yet they have this huge power. So if Kim said, and I've heard this over and over, so companies go, well, just give them everything. And they go, no, that doesn't work. It just, depletes their effectiveness or whatever. So information is really, really important. I've worked as a corporate secretary for many years and worked with teams on, you've got to summarize, you've got to kind of reveal from your point of view, what are the relevant issues? Where do you need the board to lean in? Are you sharing it for information, or does it need a decision? So it's really, really important. I think of all the times that I've worked with startups, the information flows between the board and the company is a really critical piece. Agendas and a meeting. An agenda sounds, oh yeah, of course. Agendas are really important. If you want a good outcome from your meeting, pay attention to your agenda. Work with, if you have a chair of your board or someone who's a lead sort of person on your board, and be very thoughtful about what outcomes you want, and create your agenda accordingly. Boards, committees you need, what kind of leadership you have and need, the dynamics amongst directors, and between the board and the founders and the management team. All of those are important elements. And also, you know, the relations between management. So you know, boards sometimes get pulled into, you know, problems that you're having with certain people at a different level. It's not really the board's job unless that, you know, the board really number one is the CEO, and founders are pretty much always the CEO, and they really work with you, and the rest of the operations is up to you, not the board, and that you have some processes and cadence for, you know, getting people together. One thing I've stressed a lot is instead of formal meetings and speaking to kind of building culture and sort of some good relations amongst board members, is that you have also non sort of formal meeting interaction. So, you know, lots of companies invite board members to strategic planning, not to be sort of make decisions on it, but to participate in it. So there's any number of imaginative ways that you can engage with your board. But I think these 8 things, if you sort of keep them in mind and make sure they're addressed, you'll have a much better sort of relationship with your board, but also they'll be more effective for you and to you. So Kim, you've got lots of experience with this and serving on them. So maybe I want to give an emphasis on some of those 8 items.
Yeah, the big one, the 2 big ones or 3 big ones for me actually are the agenda. And it doesn't have to be long, just as says we're meeting to talk about, so everyone's clear what the discussion points are, and it doesn't devolve into, you know, just random thought, because that's not going to help anyone. So I think that's important. I think the dynamics is a combination. Early stage is the chair is typically the founder, but the dynamics is something that it's important for the chair to make sure that the culture, the decision process, and the respect of all board members are there. So in other words, it's, you know, people not talking over each other, talking about topics that aren't relevant, etc. So it's the chair's role to control those dynamics. And I think it's important to know what, if you are the chair early stage, is what do you want to achieve, how are you going to achieve it, and what input do you need? So it's not saying we're going to limit discussion to this point for 3 minutes and then move on. You have to make sure everyone has the ability to be heard and other people are listening to their input. And I think the last one is the process part, because that one becomes, and this is my favorite topic on boards, is work plans. So that's where process comes in. And as you evolve longer, it's always good to have a calendar for your board members to say, in June, we're going to approve the budget. In September, we're going to look at compensation. In November, we're going to do this. So having that work plan helps with the process part of it. So just practical things, agendas, you know, making sure you kind of establish a good, respectful dynamic in the board table. And lastly, do a work plan. I mean, that's a very simple kind of view, but that will help a lot across the board.
And I think this all might look a little intimidating and overwhelming, but you just start in steps. Like it's a very much back to the sort of evolution chart. It's very much an evolution exercise, and you gain more experience and more knowledge of how boards work and what they do, what's effective in dealing with your board, what's not, and you kind of develop a good practice and build the framework, you know, thoughtfully at the beginning. I think Kim made the point, because it hangs around, it stays around, and then people default to it. So you want to be thoughtful and get, you know, some views of maybe the people who are going to serve on your board, or others like Kim and others who have and can give you those, and myself contribute to that thought process. If somebody has a question.
Michelle?
Hi, yes. Thank you for this presentation. It's very informative. I'm still having a little bit of a difficult time just understanding how much information or how involved do you want your board to be? So do they need to, is it more so just housekeeping issues? You tell them that you've hit this target or you've missed this target, or do you involve them when you're facing a problem? And what is the delicate balance look like? Is it just a quarterly meeting, or is it when you are trying to raise money, or how does that look like? What are key components from board members' perspective that they want to know? And from a startup's perspective, how involved do you want them to be? I guess those are my two folded questions.
Yeah. So I give all often, and Kim, you can give an answer too, because we have different. I always say, well, put yourself in their seat for a moment. So they're not involved day to day. And, you know, let's say you want to make a big acquisition, or you want to, you know, an expenditure or whatever. You know, you've done the strategic thinking, you know how it fits or whatever. But instead of articulating that, which a lot of founders do, because it's so wired into you and you understand it and you're behind it so much that you just kind of, well, here's the, you know, here's a bunch of data. And so I'm a very, you know, a briefing, some call it executive summary, an overview of the thinking behind whatever information you're sharing, highlighting areas of concern that they may want to look at. The more you present to them as a part-time person who has, you know, this huge power over you. So you want it, and sometimes I just work with boards. Some are so, they want to say, just have it all accessible to me. I'll look at what I want to know, but they're, you know, they're very savvy. They're very smart. They look, you know, can go through 40 pages, but I've also, I mean, in terms of information, I think it's not only the density and quality of the image, it's the timeliness of it. So I don't know how many times I say, if you send it overnight or the day before your meeting and expect to get some good input, what you're going to get is some really, really significant pushback instead. So I think, you know, it's just, you have to be, Kim use the word respectful, but I think you work with them, but you get very skilled at synthesizing your own thinking and sharing that and articulating that, then provide the data to back it up, is how I would say it. Kim?
Yeah, so I would say that second dimension to that is that, you know, you're obviously all in early stage companies and your boards are going to be small. They're not going to be, they will be working with you as partners in some areas. I would not be afraid of that. Management relationship is important, that you need to be trusting that you can bring forward topics to your board and vice versa. So, you know, I know in my case of the two startup or early stage, not startup, but early stage boards, it's not uncommon for the CEO to call me and say, well, you know, this is what I'm thinking and this is what I've seen. It's not a board decision, but it's part of that relationship. And and I'm not telling them do this or that or whatever. Part of it is I'm listening, and part of it is I'm kind of understanding the problem and kind of saying, well, you may want to consider this, and this is where we need to bring it forward to the board. So I think early stage, it's important to have a good relationship to be able to do that. And but I'll say the flip side is you don't want a board who wants to know every time you spent, you know, issued a purchase order or hired people. I mean, they want to know you've got an operating plan, you said you're going to hire 10 people and you hit this revenue target. You know, if you're not hitting your revenue target, you're not going to hire the 10 people. So it's that kind of discussion in terms of continuous dialogue with the board also too. In early stage, sometimes it's helpful to give a summary every month, just in an email of this is the status, this is what my goals were for the month, this is what I achieved. You're not reporting to them in a formal board manner, but you're keeping them abreast in terms of things happen pretty quick in startups. So waiting quarterly is probably too long. So if I think we're going to talk about communication.
We
later,
are. We're going to give you some good
but that's part of that
suggestions.
dynamics, and you know, kind of asking for help is they're there to help you as well, and vice versa. But there is that fine line that you don't want to drop a bomb on them and ask them to decide something you know, kind of the next day. So it's keeping that dialogue. I think that in an early stage, that dialogue and respect is important. I don't know if that helps in terms of clarifying it or.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you.
I think
Great,
Kim
thank you.
raised a really excellent point, and a lot of individuals who would like to serve even independently on a board in the early stages are also really good mentors. They're very, and I think mentorship, to me, would be one of the competencies I would want in a board member in an early stage that I can learn from. And to Kim's point, obviously Kim has that quality because they'll call her. And it's very informal. It's very much sort of more of a mentoring kind of role than, specifically board duty role. It's a
Right, and I would,
quality.
it's a trust aspect also on both sides. So I think that's the other element that we talked about: integrity, intelligence, etc. So that integrity and knowing that you can trust people who are on your board and vice versa on those informal discussions are really important early stage, in early stage. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's skip over now what we've all kind of touched on, and that's advisory boards. So hopefully we've been able to give you a bit of grounding in what a formal board or board of directors is in terms of the fiduciary roles. Advisory boards complement them, but they're not a governance alternative to a corporate board. So there's no fiduciary duty, there's no liability for an advisor. They exist to advise. So usually, as all the notes here say, essential expertise, they provide fresh ideas, perspective. So, I think there's a wide pool of really good advisors around Ottawa and most of you, but I guess you're all across the country now. But in your communities, there's probably incubators, and there's any number of people that have some of the expertise that you want. They're typically, sort of handpicked. It's usually very budget friendly people if you want to formalize an advisory board itself, or you just want to have one-off engagements with advisors. I've done advisory work, I know Kim has, and sometimes it's one-off. They have a very specific need, a specific problem, they want your insight, you sort of agree. It's and I think the bottom bullet is most important, because I've had people say, oh, I need you, and then by the time they're finished talking, they don't need me. But you need to know why you need one and what you hope to accomplish. And you change it up, like you need this person for that. And if we, I think, flip to the next slide, know what you need, and why you want it. So many people, and I used to see this a lot, they strike an advisory board and they put someone, who's had a huge career in sales and marketing and opening new channels, in South America. And they think, oh, great, I need that person. So they have this board, but they engage, they fulfill their role, but they still have this board sitting there. So I'm very much an advocate for you put a written agreement, you establish some kind of engagement expectation. So, as an advisor, that I've served out, so you want to meet once a week for the next 2 weeks. I set the window. We'll wrap this up. So it's a 60-day advisory engagement. I'm not going to sit on your advisory board forever and do nothing. I'm going to be there in and out, deliver what you need, and through a statement of work. So it's so important not to just sort of, surround yourself. And I've seen this, which is why I'm mentioning it, with people you think, oh, everybody's going to, help me. I'm going to bring all this. I'm going to have, a 12-member advisory board and give everybody maybe a little bit of equity, but you don't even need it. It's wasteful. It's not purposeful. So these four elements are sort of my sort of mission on what you should do and how you make it effective. Kim?
Yeah, so just on that, so there's a difference between it, as Donna identified, an advisor and an advisory board. And I think those lines sometimes can be confused early stage. An advisory board is one, as is noted here, what do you need them for? So an advisory board is pretty common, and I've seen it in a lot of cases where you have a group of people who can help you vet or augment your marketing expertise or marketing kind of plan in the company to provide you with strategic kind of oversight and not oversight, but overview and review of your strategic plan, give you some kind of other guidance or technical guidance, and they sit there, and that's their role on the advisory board. But you've written down, this is what I want you to do. The risk that a lot of companies do, to Donna's point, is figure I've got to get the VP of marketing for IBM on my advisory board because it'll look good on my website. And that happens a lot. And if you look at a lot of startups will have like these, kind of headshots of very senior people, and they're called advisory boards. And I've been in the case before where someone has called up and said, well, what is this person doing? Well, nothing. And we just call them up whenever we need it. That's not an advisory board. That's just someone that you maybe almost like an executive in residence or someone that you call periodically. So be super careful that you don't overreach in terms of defining that advisory board and use them. I mean, I've been nominated to advisory boards and people never call me. And it's kind of so, I'll say, well, take me off because you're not using me for what we thought we were. So be very purposeful of what you want them to do. And they become almost an extension or an expert advisor to your management team.
Yeah.
They're not doing the same thing as your governance, your board, your actual board of directors, but they really do provide you with access, whether it's to other partners, to expertise that you don't have, to connections, but be purposeful of using them. And they really are more of an extension to your management team and help you accelerate your strategic plan.
Exactly. I think I'd echo what Kim's saying. People look for advisors to get access to capital, access to markets, all kinds of different reasons, but be purposeful. So I guess so
there's been, just before we close on that though, there's been you guys have asked a lot of questions about advisory boards through here. So does that clarify the difference between an advisory board and a board of directors? I know we've had a few questions through in terms of what they are and how they are. They can have terms. They can be for 1 year, like just a 1-year term, we'll sign you up, and then we'll decide you may have another slate in a year.
Yeah, exactly. As your plan evolves. So
things change. So you need a different set of advisors. So.
But they can, as this slide says, they can coexist. So often they do.
Yeah.
What's important for you to know is one has fiduciary duty and decision-making power, and you don't want to hand out the seats. The other, you're trying to pull in, expertise in to add value as an advisor. But together, they work, and often it's very complementary to have a bit of both, and sometimes, not always, but often people do some advisory work and then they will make a leap and you will want to bring them onto your board. It's a great safe way to sort of work with them and see how they think and how they work, especially if they're unknown, as an advisor first, before you sort of give them some decision-making influence and oversight influence. So anyway, I think this is a good time for questions, because I think now we're going to talk about how you maintain stakeholder confidence and some of the communication questions that you had earlier. So I think, if anything, you take away, you understand these differences. You have a good idea of governance. You understand sort of the board's role in governance and the difference between a corporate and advisory board. So we can jump ahead then, if there's no questions. Everybody's got that? Wow, good. So maintaining stakeholder confidence, and I'm going to be turning over to Kerry and Kim at this point because they're more expert, but number one is communication and keeping investors and stakeholders updating and effectively communicating information, strategic, financial, and management information, as well as operational. So that's, sort of at the top of the list. And I think I'll turn over now. Kerry's got some really, really good slides on sort of the communication components that you should be aware of. So if you want to carry to the next slide,
Yeah.
push to the
Kim,
next
Kim,
slide.
did you want to
Carrie.
comment on communication starting out, or? Okay.
I think it's one that you really need to be conscious of keeping your shareholders informed. They don't need to know all the decisions, and you don't need to give them all the details, but you need to make sure that they understand where you're going and what you're doing. So I think that there are some elements that the shareholders need to be informed about in your shareholders agreement. You have to be associated with that. The second part is, kind of your cadence. It's various times I've done letters to my shareholders monthly. Sometimes it's usually just an email, sometimes it's quarterly, sometimes it's after the board meeting. It depends on the complexity of your shareholder base, but it's something that you do need to keep in the forefront. They put money in the company, they want to know where you're going, and it's again, it's that kind of understanding and respect. And you got to be consistent. It's got to be this, you tell the same thing to everyone. You can't tell this, something to this guy because he put more money into than someone who put less money in. They all need to know the same thing. They're all
I was just going to give a word of caution there, because I've seen it happen. And you open sort of a line of communication with an investor because, they're great. And then it's like, oh my God, they're calling me every other day. They're calling me. They want. So, and you need to know how to politely kind of shut that down. And Kim's point. In public companies, it's called selective disclosure, and it's a sin. So you can't selectively disclose and share information, to one shareholder. Their dollar's the dollar, if you think of it that way. So public companies, it's released to the public. It's released to the public. Everybody gets it. There's no insider information. And I think it's a great concept that I think you can cheat on in a private company and get away with. And, maybe some investors you just like more and you want to talk to more, and others, you don't. But I think getting a process is really helpful. And I think that's what we're going to talk about a little bit now. I think the important thing, sorry, Carrie, in Canada, and Carrie will go into it, is that we say, what should startups tell stakeholders? We haven't said just shareholders. So you may want to be thinking, and Carrie will go into this more, and I'll stop there. But, I'm just pointing out, we're talking about stakeholders now, not only shareholders. Over to you, Carrie.
Yeah. And just to echo what Don and Kim have been saying, and is around how important regular communication is, because it builds, builds trust, builds transparency. And it's something that can strengthen and protect an early stage startup. So think of it in that way too. It's not just about strengthening the relationship. In some cases, it's about protecting the organization and the relationship. And we do have stakeholders on the top here, but it's important to kind of understand that there's going to be some information that is for investors and shareholders only. And there might be a cadence that's slightly different between the communication to the shareholders versus the more general stakeholders. And more general stakeholders can mean even future, like potential investors as well, right? And there's going to be some information that you're going to share more internally, privately, that's going to be maybe through direct emails and periodic emails directly to the shareholders. When there's anything that's going to go more public facing to a broader set of stakeholders, including maybe potential future investors, that can be, maybe it's on your website or through social media or whatever. So you're going to think about sort of the message, the audience, and then that will impact the channel and the format that you're sending this information. So I'll go through, some of that in some of these slides. And this is just sort of a kind of a generally, we have quarterly and as needed, but I think even Kim alluded to that. There's going to be probably monthly updates as well that you're going to do with shareholders as well. And I think in terms of sort of best practices or sort of the best advice is ask your investors as well what they want. How often do they want to receive information? When and how do they want to hear from you? How much details do they want? That type of thing. So it'll evolve, but also ask them for that input, because you don't want to make assumptions on sort of what they have had, and maybe they've been on other boards before, and they have some expectations of what you should be doing, and if you fall short of that, that might cause issues. So I think that's important, is maybe just ask them. Kim, do you want to go through sort of the details on sort of the quarterly and the as needed on this slide?
Yeah, and I have a slightly different view in terms of if you get into the VC world, they're going to ask for everything. And I think that it's a very dangerous thing to ask them like everything that they want, because you will not, and you should not give them everything. There's some things that have to be, should be retained as confidential, and nothing to do with what their role is as a board director or a shareholder. So be very careful that you don't over rotate and end up with a big data set. Keep a dashboard, and I think that dashboard, the KPIs and the health of the company mean, kind of key indicators that show. So whether or not it's we wanted to close 3 deals this quarter and our KPI is closing 3 deals, you don't have to go into saying the dollar value or the delivery cycle or whatever, but we said 3 deals, we closed 4 deals, or we closed 2 deals, that type of thing. If you've got recent achievement, if you've been successful with penetrating a channel partner, there's nothing wrong with saying that. Where you have to be careful with all of these is if you do sign deals with other parties, that you have the right to disclose. So you have to be, and that's why I'm saying, like, be careful about disclosing too much, because you may not have, if you sign a channel partner or a new customer, you should ask them, can I disclose this to my shareholders, or can I disclose this to my stakeholders? Because they may say no. So be very careful about that.
And sometimes I'll add to this a little, if I may. And it's important to differentiate, I think, some of the things Kim said, especially about VCs, because I've seen laundry lists of things that they ask for that get embedded in a shareholders agreement and go, this is silly. Like, we need to hire a full-time person to give you that information every month. So you negotiate it and you parse it down and you make other commitments. But that kind of, I just want to differentiate that sort of compliance reporting, I'll call it. Maybe your agreement says they get the balance sheet every month, they get a P&L every month, they get this. So you're bound to give that to your shareholders. What we're talking about here, I think, includes, broader speaking, stakeholders, of which your shareholders is a stakeholder, but differentiate sort of communication from a purpose of goodwill and building and pumping up the success of your operation or your business, versus what your mandatory disclosures or reporting that you have to make under a shareholders agreement.
But be very, I think the key message here is that this is really to indicate to your stakeholders really kind of key milestones of the company and key events. So if you keep it in that context, that's what you're communicating. And it's not communicating to all of your stakeholders or shareholders your balance sheet every month if you don't need to, if it's not part of your requirement or your shareholders agreement, and it's not going in and kind of saying, well, I had this guy, resign because he got a job offer for $100,000 more. Those are not things that you would generally send out. What you would send out is saying that, kind of we're continuing our path in terms of staffing our professional services arm. We are seeing kind of movement in the market, or the market is challenging for us, but we're continuing to push along our goals. That would be an appropriate communication. So, keep it in the point where you're not opening the whole kimono in terms of your operation or, kind of details of the specifics, but you're indicating successes, momentums, and any, kind of challenges that you're seeing. But also, if you indicate a challenge, what are you doing to mitigate that challenge?
Exactly.
So, so you shall.
And always truthful, right, Kim?
Always truthful. Yes. No bullshit on it, but sorry. Not that I haven't seen that before, but
yeah.
Michelle, we had a question. Sorry.
Yeah, just a quick question about, are there any standard rules around how many segmentations you should have within your stakeholders? Because what I'm thinking is, from my perspective, what my investors would want to know is, as it's mentioned here, if I'm in financial trouble or if I'm experiencing roadblocks, whereas my channel partner, someone like Chio, disclosing that information to them would not necessarily reflect nicely on the company itself. So are there any processes in terms of startups just having different segmentations? What is too many? What is too little?
No, but keep it general. And I don't really think that if Chio is a channel partner, you really have to consider them in terms of quarterly update on the company. I mean, they're using your product. You may want to kind of give them kind of an update that, in addition to Chio, we've been successful in delivering or deploying our product in X, Y, and Z hospitals. That might be appropriate for them, but keep it appropriate to the receiver, I guess is the best way to put it. When we talk about stakeholders, that's what that would refer. But you have your shareholders, so you got a whole list of shareholders, and keeping an open communication with them. You might go into a little bit more detail, but it's really, they just want to know that you're meeting your plans, meeting your targets. If you're running into a roadblock, you have a way to mitigate it. You're showing momentum on the business, that type of thing. And and then they, obviously your investors have things that they will get from the shareholders agreement, but every VC asks for 10 times more than that. Yeah. And you have to have a conviction to say, what do you need it for? Because as soon as you give them more, they're going to ask more and more and more. So it's really the question in terms of they need to say why they need it and how they're going to use it. And nothing wrong with asking them. I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I think that's it for
fine.
here.
Anything else on this slide that
No.
cover? Any questions from anyone else?
I think we're good.
Okay. So just generally, some tips for communicating. Create a plan so you know sort of why, who, what, and how you want to communicate. So thinking of it sort of from a strategic communications perspective. And these are just a few more kind of tactical things, but have a corporate policy, and it requires a press releases or media inquiries to go to a named person. I mean, usually I imagine it would be the founder, CEO, or if you're at the point of having a marketing person, then there could be somebody marketing that is assigned to that. And think about at a certain point, you're going to know maybe when that point is. You might want to get some training for a spokesperson and make sure they're well informed, authoritative, and can provide the best answers. And then Donna, maybe this last point you can comment on: follow the rules and stay compliant.
Oh, well, you never want to be giving the message that, oh, we forgot to file something, or mandatory, we forgot to report, or whatever. So keeping your house clean is what sort of follow the rules means, and keeping doing the things that don't really always generate revenue for you, but that are necessary to do, are just as important. So you're all in different businesses, and if you have tasks that need to be done to maintain other licensing requirement, registration, or whatever, that you stay compliant, because that's news that no investor and no board ever wants to hear. So it's however menial it is, stay compliant would be the key point here.
Okay. So this slide here, there's a lot on it, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but I want you to have it. And it was just sort of around, it's a model that looks at all the types of sort of media per se, like the channels that you could communicate. And it's sometimes just nice to have a framework to kind of figure out, okay, where do these actually land? In what sort of category are they? And the next slide will go over, I think, where the priority should be sort of at this stage, which is really in the owned media, which when you think about owned media or owned channels, it's the ones that you fully control, right? So it's your website or a blog or your corporate social media, your email system, if you do an email newsletter, the media kit, if you're at the point of having a media kit that lives and resides on your website. So it's those types of format of media. And then there's different kinds. So again, you'll evolve. Like, so if you, for instance, you create a press release, that's something you create. If you put it out there and you get a news article written about you because of that press release, well, the news article itself would be sort of fall under that earned media. So I just wanted you to have it. It's not something to go deep in right now, but then just as you're thinking about, as you evolve and grow the different channels, it's just so you know kind of where they sit and can prioritize. Kim, I don't know if you want to add anything on this.
I think it's a really helpful slide. I've never, I always saw it as one big envelope that I knew nothing and well, what media is what. So I think it's very valuable, very informative.
Okay, so on that, I think where the priority should be for kind of what your stage right now is the owned media. I think this is where, and again, thinking about, if you think about your audience, your message, that will then dictate sort of the format or the channel that you're going to use. So your own media is your website and any press release, your corporate social media. So thinking about, is it something that should go on social media? Maybe not. What you're sending to your investors and shareholders is going to be different than the general stakeholders. So in terms of sort of own media, think about your own media as your LinkedIn profile. So especially this early stage, the founder is sort of synonymous with the company. And so you want to make sure to pay attention to, well, what's in your LinkedIn profile? Is it the consistency with the corporate social media, the corporate LinkedIn page? Because people are investing in you. And so, you need to be reflected online in sort of a consistent way with sort of what you're saying from a company perspective as well. So there's ways to optimize that. And then if you're using sort of an e-newsletter format to communicate, again, the audience impacts which one you choose. So say a format, for investors, it might be, emails or a data SharePoint folder or whatever that and Kim, you can comment more, you've got more, and sort of the ways to communicate. Whereas if it's something for more broad stakeholders, it might be something you have a mailing list, an e-newsletter set up through MailChimp or something, a free service, or maybe you even go to LinkedIn. LinkedIn has a newsletter format that you can use as sort of a corporate. If you have, you're thinking about investment, 6 months or 12 months down the road, you want to be kind of building up profile externally and sort of trying to engage with potential investors. And so thinking about, what you include in there. Kim, anything else for you on that?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered off most of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions on that? At this point? No? Okay. And then something else is just that what you can do in terms of sort of mapping because I like to have frameworks because I think they're so useful for making decisions, right? Because it can feel a bit overwhelming. Okay, well, I do this, do I do that or whatever. But if you have this kind of framework to kind of distill, it can help inform your decision making. So if you want to think about who your stakeholders are, you can kind of map them out in sort of on one axis, the stakeholder interest versus the stakeholder influence, right? And so people on your board of directors are stakeholders that have high influence and high interest. VCs as an example, if they have a nominee board member, well, they're going to have a high interest and high influence. So it's just sort of thinking of that. So key investors, keep them satisfied and engage with them frequently. And so if you do this mapping, that's going to then help direct sort of how often you communicate with them, the format that you communicate with them, how much information. I don't know if that, any questions on that. And I'll just sort of putting that into practice in terms of sort of here's some when you're building your communication plan, you can use this. If you've done some of the stakeholder mapping, you can then think about sort of all the different media channels that I showed in that PESO model and think about, okay, well, which ones apply and which one should I be using for which stakeholders? So in the top right-hand corner, those high value investors who have a high interest and high influence, maybe it's quarterly visits, maybe it's monthly. It's very much two-way communication, and some of it is customized. Whereas anyone that has in the left quadrant low interest and low influence, it might just be an update on a web page or a social media update, that type of thing. Or like I said, a MailChimp list that is more generic for broader interest of stakeholders. So that's my last slide on communication. So I think, I don't have another slide after that. It's just sort of generally, so I think it kind of opens it up for discussion and any additional questions that people might have. Or Kim, if you want to add anything else on communications and stakeholder
I
communications.
don't think so. I think it's,
Okay.
you know, be truthful, but you don't have to disclose the whole shop, so.
So hand
Michelle?
up.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask another question about communications, because that is the one area where I feel like my company kind of struggles, because initially we had an online sign up for people who are interested in our product. And then it was a generic MailChimp list where we started bombarding them with our updates and what we've achieved, and, you know, going through the regulatory, whatnot. And then people started dropping off. So just trying to understand, and then I guess this slide kind of addresses that as to which category to, I guess, further segment them out into who's interested in our journey versus who's interested in our product, and who's interested in our stats versus who wants to be an end user. And so are there any other tips that you have, or any tools that you recommend in trying to segment them out, or you know, just populate my calendar with some sort of reminders to engage with them differently? How does that, because as a startup, you're doing everything within your team with like team of 5, so we don't have a marketing person dedicated to doing this. So any tips would just be very helpful.
Yeah, I would say don't overcomplicate it would be my number one discussion. Keep it simple. I think that there is a difference between communicating with that stakeholder versus sending out information for a marketing or product adoption process. So if you're trying to attract new partners or new customers, you may go into a little bit more product related type stuff, but keep it simple, keep it very direct. I mean, at this stage, you don't have the complexity of, you know, VCs or other kind of higher net worth shareholders you have to worry about. So I would personally keep it very simple, keep it associated with key highlights, milestones, and, you know, where you are on your continuum to keep them interested. You may want to do a subset of that to the people that you want to attract, and use it as almost a sales tool to, you know, things that they would be interested in.
Yeah, I think I would add that there's a difference between this sort of the strategic communications with stakeholders and then marketing to potential customers or channel partners. And so you kind of need both. You need a strategic communication plan that sort of covers off these stakeholders, but then also a marketing plan and so that's kind of how I would segment it as a kind of marketer by profession. That's how I think about it is, and then you're taking your potential either channel partner or direct customer, you know, down a journey in terms of product release. So they're going to be more interested, and it's thinking about, well, you know, who is the audience, what's their objective, and then from that determining the message and the format and the cadence based on that. So for these customers, you know, if you're doing all these sorts of updates about the company that aren't relevant to them, they might be like, okay, forget it. I don't even want to be part of it. So they would drop off your list. So I would segment from at least at a minimum, a customer segment, and then kind of determine from there, with keeping it simple, as Kim says, is, you know, maybe your website update, you know, your sign up list, maybe I don't know, maybe even have 2 different ones that kind of like, it's a journey. If you're, hey, I want to get your product, versus, you know, I may want to invest in you. And so you've got them going down a different path to capture them.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. There's another question there, Sydney.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the talk so far. It's been really informative. And I think I'm going to build off what Isha was pointing to, which is this is almost like a full-time job, it seems, in order to manage everybody, whether it's the stakeholders or the shareholders themselves. So when we are thinking of, like, once we've made the plan and we know, okay, we want to talk to these people monthly, we want to take to these people quarterly, but we need 3 different communications for the 3 different kind of groups, whether it's customers or stakeholders, are you creating a project management tool to help yourself track when you should be reaching out to each group?
So I'll just comment on it. And I know Katie's she's the expert and the subject matter expert here, but be realistic. I mean, what I was noting to you before, what we're presenting here is really, I wouldn't call it the end state, but as you mature, these are things to consider. So today, most of you are a company of less than 10. And your job is to get, you know, your strategy out, your product out, to engage with investors and move your commercial into commercialization. This is an element that helps support it, but it should not be a full-time job at this stage. You will evolve into it at some point, but you know, when I was mentioning before, keep it simple. I mean, even in the case where, you know, in startup companies I worked for, it was an email that had like 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs, and it was basically, you know, just want to let you know that, you know, we had some exciting news this month. We signed these, you know, 3 channel partners, if we could disclose them, or if not, just saying a channel partner in this region. We've, you know, we continue to meet our goals in terms of our, you know, whether it's regulatory approval, not saying what they are, but continue to move them forward. And, you know, we are, you know, meeting whatever other thing is relevant. Keep it really simple. The idea is to create that dialogue with them in an early stage aspect. Then you can start streaming and being a lot more strategic with it. But your first job is to, you know, create that dialogue with, I would think, your shareholders, number one, because you're going to go back to them for more money at some point. I'm pretty sure. So you want to make sure that, you know, they don't have to do a whole pile of catch up. So they know that, you know, you're a going concern, you're doing a great job, you're meeting your kind of targets, etc. Then the next layer, if it becomes important to start to develop, whether it's partnerships or customer base, maybe you have a separate stream for those, but that's part of your sales and marketing campaign. So my advice at the stage you're at, keep it really simple, but know that as you work out your strategic plan over the next, you know, kind of 2, 3, 4 years, you're going to have to start to do that segmentation. You're going to have to start being more creative in terms of information disclosed, etc.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sorry. Anyway.
So I think we're, I hope we sort of achieved our mission today. Wanted to kind of give you a broad understanding of governance, differentiate, teach you about what the board does, what an advisory board is, and sort of the whole communication engagement with your stakeholders, but in particular for you folks, your shareholders at the early stages. Are there any more questions? Anybody? It's been really, really delightful. I'm very inspired by the number of you taking this journey. I echo what Kim said. It's hard and lots of lifting, and I think Katie said at the beginning, this deck will be stored somewhere where you can access it. And I think I certainly invite comments. Kim, we didn't have your QR code to put up here.
No, that's okay.
Kim
that's
does
okay.
as well, and so does Kerry. So we're able to you know, give you crystallize some of your thinking on any of these topics as you move forward in your journey. And I personally wish you all the very best of luck. I know you have some pitches coming up. I'm going to try and attend some of the later ones. I think they're going to be held at Invest Ottawa, but really, really wish you a lot of luck and a lot of goodwill going forward. Very, very admirable and very nice to see so many women and young women taking this journey. So those are my parting thoughts. It's been really, really a pleasure to be here today.
Beautiful. Kerry and Kim, is there anything else you'd like to add before you hop off?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that, you know, starting off and being an entrepreneur, you have to wear a lot of hats. This is one of them that we've given you some insight into what you need to be aware of. But I would say you need to be aware of what will evolve over time. But just try and be pragmatic and do what is right for you and your company at this stage. You don't have to, I mean, I think you will have to do everything at some point, but at this stage, you know, keep it practical with what makes sense for you today, and you know, keep it grounded. And as you evolve, things will change, but I think it's you know, we're giving you kind of a little bit of a you know, an overview of the end game, but you will evolve to that. So, so thanks for the time.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to everyone and just really wish everyone the best in this adventure. And I admire all of you because to do that is to do what you're doing is incredibly brave and bold. So, you know, anything we can do to help support that, we're happy to.
Beautiful. Thank you all so